if tariffs on Chinese products were raised further, then the Chinese would almost certainly have to retaliate much more strongly. If Trump is true to his kind of campaign speeches, these tariffs will go up to 60%. And if that happened, in other words, another 20% on top of where we are, then I think the Chinese actually would blink.
China just wrapped up its biggest political event of the year. The National People's Congress is a well-choreographed meeting of 3,000 of the country's most powerful politicians, all while a trade war with the United States is heating up. With me here to discuss is George Magnus from Oxford University's China Center. George, this is a very pre-scripted meeting and largely ceremonial, but were there any surprises this year?
I don't think there were too many surprises, to be honest. In fact, people were expecting, if there were going to be anything that would have kind of taken us a little bit taken us aside, we were expecting to hear maybe a more powerful, maybe a more potent stimulus to the economy than we actually got. But in fact, what we heard really through all of the meetings and through the plethora of documents that were published was really more of the same. In other words, more of what we'd heard at the Central Economic Work Conference last December, more of what we heard at the third plenum last July, which is this concern about the economy, but not such concern that they're desperate to do anything dramatic to change the outlook for the economy in 2025. So no, is the short answer. Nothing really surprising.
Now, what were the key takeaways at this Congress?
Well, the thing that I think most people were looking for was what sort of growth target would the Chinese government set for this year. Again, everybody was expecting it to be about 5%, and surprise, surprise, it was about 5%. So how are they going to achieve this? Well, they're planning to increase their budget deficit, their fiscal deficit, to a record 4% of GDP. But you shouldn't be too distracted by that number. The real number is probably somewhere close to 10 or 11% of GDP because of the limitations in what the government actually formally classifies as the budget deficit. So there is a bit more fiscal spending. Interest rates will come down some more. The reserve requirements on banks will be cut. There'll be further measures to stabilize the housing market. There'll be a bit more money for what they call the consumer trade-in programs, where you can cash in your old consumer goods for new ones, which are subsidized. Same for small business equipment. More borrowing, a little bit more on pensions, a little bit more on family care. But, none of this really adds up to a kind of what people call the kind of bazooka type of stimulus. The government is quite restrained in what it feels it can and should do. And of course, they are nervous about what might happen in the external economy, particularly with regards to trade and to tariffs and so on and so forth.
Now, at the Congress, Premier Li Qiang described the country's economy as a giant ship sailing steadily towards the future. But economic waters are looking pretty choppy. China slapped retaliatory tariffs on the United States just this Monday. Really, we're seeing a trade war heating up between the two countries. Were there signs of worry at this Congress?
Well, there are the gratuitous references in the quite sort of tedious documentation and in the formal speeches about a difficult external environment, and there are threats and there are challenges and they'll have to be managed and so on and so forth. So we heard all of this, and also the Minister for Commerce also spoke about measures which the government was going to take to try to mitigate the effects of a more difficult external environment on Chinese exporters. And so there were some measures that he announced, which included efforts to promote green trade, more trade in intermediate goods, setting up of special regulations and zones for exporters, cutting back on red tape. This kind of stuff is really for the birds, as we say in English. It doesn't really amount to much, and it's not really going to change anything at all. And so, the tariffs which the Chinese government already knows about, which is the 20% additional tariffs which President Trump has announced. They can probably cope with that at the margin, but I think they would find it much more difficult and would have to take other action, I think, if the tariff war, the trade war got worse, if Trump started to increase tariffs by the month, or if there wasn't any kind of temporary trade deal, which a lot of people are still talking about, to be fair.
As mentioned, China imposed retaliatory tariffs on the United States this Monday, focused on agricultural products. Now, people have noted that these tariffs are less hefty than those imposed by the US on China. So could this be part of some sort of strategy?
Yeah, it's possible that the relatively moderate or limited response by Beijing is part of a strategy to keep open the option of eventually having a meeting between President Trump and President Xi Jinping and reaching some kind of trade pact to purchase more products from one another, much as they tried to do under the Phase 1 trade deal during the first Trump administration. I think it's fair to say that if they did do this, it would be a largely cosmetic arrangement because the structural relationship or systemic relationship between America and China is one in which they're trying to de-emphasize one another in critical and national security type of supply chains, particularly in areas of technology, artificial intelligence, and even in biomedicine and pharmaceuticals. So both things can be true, right? There can be a really bad trade relationship between the two countries because of self-reliance and trying to sort of de-emphasize one another, which is a sort of nationalistic type of approach which both countries are pursuing. But there could also be a cosmetic and temporary arrangement under which purchase arrangements can be agreed. For example, agricultural products and liquefied natural gas flowing from America to China, and other products, capital equipment, machinery equipment, that's non-national security relevant, going the other way.
Right, so keeping the doors for a cosmetic deal open maybe, but are there any lines of communication right now between US and Chinese diplomats or even their leaders?
Yeah, I think there is, or there are lines open, and I think that those were basically set up again, I should say, under the Biden administration, when people like Janet Yellen visited Beijing and other American cabinet ministers visited and reset basically the dialogue infrastructure, so to speak, so that there would be a discussion between economic ministers, foreign policy ministers, defense officials, and so on, which had actually sort of withered during and after the COVID years. So those communications are pretty much intact now, I think.
Right, so we mentioned these 20% tariffs placed on China by the US right now, but this week China also imposed tariffs on metal, and China is the world's largest steel exporter. Now, how much of that steel goes to the US from China, and how painful are these metal tariffs for the country?
Well, not a huge amount of steel goes into is part of the trade between China and the United States, and the bigger problem, I think, for China, I would say, is that some countries like Brazil and other India, for example, or other areas that are, that for whom producing steel is quite important, actually are becoming increasingly vexed, increasingly concerned about what they regard as the dumping of Chinese steel. So, there's a lot of trade conflict going on in the world, which is quite aside from that between the United States and China, the United States and pretty much everybody else. But I mean, the problem is that China's economic model predisposes it to produce loads and loads of stuff that's far in excess of what they can consume at home. And it ends up with declining prices and basically massive exports to the rest of the world, which is causing and is the proximate cause of rising amounts of trade tension, in which some of the so-called global south countries, I mentioned India and Brazil already, but it includes also countries like Turkey, Indonesia, Philippines, Malaysia, and so on, are rather uncomfortable with the flooding of their markets and sensitive industries by Chinese goods.
Right, so this time of trade conflicts for a huge exporter like China must be daunting. So were there any solutions being floated at this Congress, perhaps, that signal how China would offset any losses in its export market?
No. In fact, I mean, apart from saying that they're going to vigorously promote domestic consumption, which they've said before, and actually I don't think they're really committed to doing that anyway. But apart from that, the main focus of China and of the Chinese government is what Xi Jinping calls high quality development, which is really the promotion of what they call their strategic emerging industries, which is semiconductors, aerospace, electric vehicles, batteries, and even extending into AI, biomedicine, pharma, and so on. So, I mean, all of these things are really, really important. This is really the model that China is pursuing to improve its resilience and its strength, and that it thinks will lead to improving living standards for its people. It's not something which actually most Western economists, and which even a number of Chinese economists would recommend. But this is the avenue that they're going down. And the upshot of this is to basically create huge supply in the world, which is the source of rising trade tension and trade conflict. There was nothing in the Congress that suggests that anything is going to change.
What will you be watching from the Chinese economy and from the Chinese leadership in the weeks to come?
I think that the only thing that I think I'm a little bit uncertain about really is whether, if the relationship between the United States and China deteriorates to the point where the tariff war picks up momentum, and let's say American tariffs. So Trump has announced an additional 20%. That's on top of the 20% that was already there before. So they're now up to around effective rate of about 35 to 40%. But if Trump is true to his kind of campaign speeches, which he was making last year, these tariffs will go up to 60%. And if that happened, in other words, another 20% on top of where we are, then I think the Chinese actually would blink. And I think then they would probably, almost certainly, I think, allow their exchange rate to depreciate against the US dollar to try to compensate for the effect of the tariffs. And that in itself is bad for China's economy and would get everybody else rather upset as well. So it would not be a good sign if for China, or indeed for world trade, if tariffs on Chinese products were raised further, because then the Chinese would almost certainly have to retaliate much more strongly, I think.
George Magnus from Oxford University's China Center, thank you so much.
Thank you.